The Galactic Academy's Advanced Predator Classification course was held in what could only be described as the universe's most pretentious lecture hall. Floating holographic displays showed complex mathematical formulas, while the walls pulsed with that soft blue light that screamed, "We're very serious about education here." Students from 17 different species sat in perfectly arranged semicircles, their various appendages poised over data tablets, ready to absorb the wisdom of the ages. Professor Vexthul stood at the front of the class like a scaly monument to academic arrogance. His reptilian features were permanently fixed in an expression that suggested he'd just smelled something unpleasant, though considering his species breathed methane, that might have been literal. His credentials were impressive enough to make a peacock jealous. 3 PhDs in xenobiology, author of The Definitive Guide to Galactic Predators, and winner of the prestigious Zorblex Prize for outstanding achievement in being insufferably correct about everything. "Today, class," Professor Vexthul began, his voice carrying the tone of someone who'd never been wrong about anything, ever, "we delve into the mathematical precision of predator classification, a science so exact, so perfectly calibrated, that it has remained unchanged for over 2,000 galactic cycles." The students nodded in unison, a sea of tentacles, antennae, and various breathing apparatus bobbing in agreement. There was Creoxtel, whose species had evolved from something that looked like a cross between a jellyfish and a filing cabinet. Next to her sat Blorndok, whose people had somehow managed to develop space travel despite being essentially sentient tree stumps. And in the back corner, trying very hard not to knock anything over with his crystalline protrusions, was Zephyrquin, whose species communicated primarily through color changes that were giving everyone mild headaches. Then there was Jake Morrison. Jake sat in the middle of the classroom, looking about as out of place as a rubber duck in a philosophy lecture. While his classmates had spent centuries perfecting their note-taking techniques, Jake was still figuring out how to work his data tablet without accidentally ordering 17 cases of Rigelian protein paste. His Earth-standard clothes looked positively primitive compared to the flowing robes and bio-integrated tech suits around him, and his habit of chewing on his stylus was causing visible distress to the nearby students. "Mr. Morrison," Professor Vexthul said, his voice dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for explaining basic concepts to houseplants, "I trust you're prepared to expand your limited terrestrial perspective with some actual scientific knowledge." Jake looked up from his tablet, where he'd been doodling what appeared to be a stick figure riding a dinosaur. "Oh, absolutely, Professor. I'm really excited to learn about, he squinted at his notes. "Predator math stuff." The professor's scaled nostrils flared slightly. This was going to be a long semester. Professor Vexthul activated the main holographic display with a flourish that suggested he'd been practicing this moment in front of a mirror for weeks. A complex three-dimensional chart materialized in the air, complete with pulsing nodes, interconnected lines, and enough mathematical symbols to make a quantum physicist weep with joy. "Behold," he announced, gesturing toward the display like a magician revealing his greatest trick, "the universal predator hierarchy. 2 millennia of research, countless doctoral dissertations, and more peer reviews than there are stars in the Andromeda galaxy have produced this masterpiece of scientific classification." The chart showed a neat pyramid structure, with Class 1 at the bottom and Class 10 at the apex. Each level was color-coded, cross-referenced, and backed by equations that would have made Einstein throw his hands up and take up pottery instead. "Class 1, the professor continued, pointing to the bottom tier with his laser pointer, "represents your basic herbivorous life forms. Harmless, predictable, and about as threatening as a particularly aggressive salad. The fluffernoids of Kepler 4.2b are a prime example. Their most dangerous feature is their tendency to cause diabetes through excessive cuteness." A few students chuckled politely. Jake raised his hand. "Yes, Mr. Morrison. So, what about rabbits?" Professor Vexthul blinked slowly, the way someone might when asked to explain calculus to a houseplant. "Rabbits, Mr. Morrison, are Class 1 herbivores. They eat vegetation and pose no threat to anything larger than a carrot." "Right, but what about the ones with the big pointy teeth?" "I beg your pardon?" "Killer rabbits. They're totally a thing." The professor's eye twitched. "Mr. Morrison, I can assure you that in all my years of studying predator classification, there has never been a documented case of a carnivorous rabbit." Jake shrugged. "Okay, but what about the ones that carry diseases, or the ones that eat their own babies when they're stressed?" The classroom fell silent. Several students exchanged glances. Crixtel made a noise that sounded like a deflating balloon having an existential crisis. Moving on, Professor Vexthul said quickly, advancing to the next slide. Class 5 predators represent the middle tier. These are your standard pack hunters, ambush predators, and moderately dangerous solo operators. The razor fins of Proxima Centauri B, for instance, achieve a Class 5 rating through their coordinated hunting strategies and mildly toxic secretions. Jake's hand shot up again. What about wolves? Wolves, Mr. Morrison, would likely classify as Class 4 or 5 depending on pack size and environmental factors. Cool. And what about the ones that hunt whales? Professor Vexthul paused, his laser pointer hovering uncertainly. I'm sorry, what? Orcas. Killer whales. They hunt in packs and take down stuff way bigger than them. Sometimes they just kill for fun. The professor's confident expression began to crack around the edges. For fun? Oh yeah. They're basically the psychopaths of the ocean. Super smart, super deadly, and they teach their kids how to torture their prey for entertainment. Zephyr Quinn's crystalline structure shifted from a calm blue to a disturbing shade of yellow-green. Other students were starting to look uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact with Jake. Perhaps, Professor Vexthul said, his voice slightly strained, we should focus on properly documented galactic species rather than these colorful anecdotes from your home planet. Jake nodded agreeably, settling back in his chair. Professor Vexthul visibly relaxed, thinking he'd successfully steered the conversation back to safe, academic waters. He was about to learn that when it came to Jake Morrison, there was no such thing as safe waters. The professor clicked to the next slide, displaying the Class 8 through 10 predators with obvious pride. Now, at the apex of our classification system, we have the truly dangerous species. Class 8 predators like the shadow stalkers of Vega Prime, capable of phasing through solid matter to ambush their prey. Class 9 predators such as the Void Hunters, who can survive in the vacuum of space and hunt starships. And finally, Class 10, represented by only 3 known species in the entire galaxy, including the legendary Omega predators of the Cygnus Nebula. The students sat in reverent silence, absorbing the gravity of these apex predators. Professor Vexthul basked in the moment, clearly savoring his role as the bearer of cosmic wisdom. Jake's hand went up again. Yes, Mr. Morrison? The professor's tone suggested he was already regretting this decision. So where do tigers fit in this ranking? Professor Vexthul blinked. Tigers? Yeah, you know, big orange cats with stripes. Where would they go on your chart? The professor's expression shifted from confusion to mild amusement. Mr. Morrison, Earth's local fauna, while perhaps impressive by your planetary standards, hardly registers on a galactic scale. Your tigers would likely be classified as Class 2 or 3 at most, large herbivores with minor defensive capabilities. Herbivores? Jake's eyebrows shot up. Professor, tigers are carnivores. They hunt and eat meat. Aye, well, Class 3 then. Minor predators. Jake scratched his head. I don't think you understand. Tigers are like really good at killing things. They're ambush predators that can take down prey twice their size. They're basically giant murder machines with teeth like daggers and claws that can rip through steel. The professor's smile became strained. Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your enthusiasm for your home planet's wildlife, but giant murder machines is hardly scientific terminology. Okay, let me put it this way, Jake said, leaning forward with the enthusiasm of someone about to share their favorite fun fact. A tiger's bite force is around 1,000 pounds per square inch. They can leap horizontally up to 30 feet. They hunt alone, which means each individual tiger is basically a solo killing machine. They're so good at hunting that they've literally eaten people throughout history. Like, thousands of people. There's this one tiger that supposedly killed over 400 humans. The classroom had gone very quiet. Several students were now actively typing on their data tablets, presumably looking up Earth predators on the galactic internet. And that's just one tiger, Jake continued cheerfully. They're ambush predators, so they can sneak up on pretty much anything. They're excellent swimmers, unlike most cats. Oh, and they have night vision, so they can hunt in complete darkness. Plus, they're smart. Really smart. They can problem solve and adapt their hunting strategies. Professor Vexthul's laser pointer was now shaking slightly. Mr. Morrison, while these creatures may seem impressive by terrestrial standards. Oh, and they're basically indestructible, Jake interrupted. There are stories of tigers surviving multiple gunshot wounds and still mauling their attackers. They've been known to break into human settlements just to drag people away. And the really crazy part? Humans think they're beautiful. We put them in zoos and take selfies with them. Kazriel made a sound like a garbage disposal having a nervous breakdown. Zephyrquin had turned a shade of purple that probably meant existential dread in his species' color language. You put these creatures in enclosures? Blorndok asked, his wooden features creaking with concern. For entertainment? Oh yeah, Jake said brightly. Kids love them. Tigers are like super popular at birthday parties and stuff. Well, not the actual tigers, obviously, but tiger-themed parties. Although there was this one guy who kept a tiger as a pet in his apartment. Professor Vextool's confident demeanor was cracking like a dam under pressure. Mr. Morrison, surely you're exaggerating. No sapient species would willingly coexist with such creatures. Actually, that brings up another point, Jake said, completely missing the growing panic in the room. Tigers aren't even the worst predators on Earth. The silence that followed Jake's statement was the kind of silence usually reserved for moments right before something explodes. Professor Vextool's laser pointer had stopped shaking, mainly because he'd dropped it entirely. It clattered to the floor with a sound that might as well have been a funeral bell for galactic academia. Not the worst? Crickstill whispered, her jellyfish-like form quivering in what could only be described as mortal terror. Oh, not even close, Jake said with the casual air of someone discussing the weather. I mean, tigers are impressive, but they're land-based. If you really want to talk about apex predators, you gotta go aquatic. Take sharks, for example. Several students were now frantically typing on their tablets. The soft pinging of research notifications filled the air like a digital countdown to doom. Sharks are basically living missiles with teeth, Jake continued, warming to his subject. The great white shark can bite with a force of 4,000 pounds per square inch. That's 4 times stronger than a tiger. They can smell blood from miles away, and they've been perfecting their killing technique for over 400 million years. They're older than trees, Professor. They're literally older than trees, and they've spent all that time getting better at eating things. Professor Vextool made a strangled noise that sounded like a balloon deflating in reverse. 4,000 pounds per square inch? Oh, and they can jump, Jake added helpfully. Great whites can launch themselves completely out of the water when they're hunting. Picture a 20-foot-long missile made of teeth and muscle flying through the air, and humans go swimming with them. For fun. Lorndok's wooden features had gone completely pale, which was disturbing considering his species was essentially living driftwood. You enter their domain voluntarily? Shark cage diving is a huge tourist industry, Jake explained. People pay good money to get in the water with great whites, although sometimes the sharks figure out how to get into the cages, which is always exciting. Zephyrquin had cycled through so many colors that he was starting to look like a malfunctioning Christmas tree. What? What else? He managed to ask, though his chromatic patterns suggested he really didn't want to know. Well, there's crocodiles, Jake said thoughtfully. Saltwater crocodiles can grow up to 23 feet long and have the strongest bite force of any animal on Earth, about 3,700 pounds per square inch. They're basically living dinosaurs that can hold their breath for an hour and perform what's called a death roll, where they grab their prey and spin until everything comes apart. The professor had sunk into his chair, staring at his holographic predator classification chart like it had personally betrayed him. Death? Roll? Oh yeah, it's brutal. But here's the really crazy part. Crocodiles are excellent mothers. They carry their babies around in their mouths and protect them fiercely. It's actually kind of sweet, if you ignore the fact that they could crush your skull without even trying. Sweet, Crickstill repeated faintly. And then there's bears, Jake continued, oblivious to the growing hysteria around him. Polar bears can weigh up to 1,500 pounds and run 25 miles per hour. They're basically giant white tanks with claws. Grizzly bears can flip over 700-pound rocks with one paw. And humans? We have teddy bears. We give our children small, cuddly versions of these massive predators as comfort objects. The room was now filled with the sounds of panicked research and what could only be described as academic whimpering. Students were pulling up videos on their tablets, and the horrified gasps were coming in waves. Mr. Morrison, Professor Vextool said weakly, surely your species doesn't actually encounter these creatures regularly. Oh, all the time, Jake said cheerfully. My uncle got chased by a bear last summer while camping, and my friend Dave went swimming with sharks on his honeymoon. Said it was the most romantic thing he'd ever done. Romantic, the professor repeated, his voice hollow. But honestly, if we're talking about the really dangerous stuff, you can't forget about pack hunters. Wolves, for instance. They're basically the inspiration for every military tactical manual ever written. They coordinate attacks, use complex strategies, and they never give up. Ever. There are stories of wolf packs tracking their prey for hundreds of miles. Jake paused, noticing that several students were now hyperventilating. Oh, and they're making a comeback. Conservation efforts, you know. Really heartwarming stuff. Conservation? Blorndok wheezed. You're bringing them back? Well, they never really went away, Jake said. But yeah, we're helping them repopulate areas where they used to live. Wolves are actually really important for the ecosystem. They help control prey populations and… Mr. Morden, Professor Vextel's voice cracked like a whip. Perhaps we should take a brief recess. Jake looked around at his classmates, finally noticing their expressions of abject terror. Oh, are you guys okay? You look a little pale. Well, paler than usual, I mean. The professor was now clutching his chest, staring at his life's work with the expression of a man watching his house burn down. How do humans survive on this planet? Oh, we don't just survive, Jake said with a grin that was probably meant to be reassuring but came across as absolutely terrifying. We thrive. We're actually the apex predators. The words hung in the air like a confession at a murder trial. Professor Vextel's reptilian features had gone through several shades of green before settling on what could only be described as existential crisis beige. His holographic predator classification chart flickered weakly, as if it too was having doubts about its own existence. Apex predators, he whispered, the words barely audible above the sound of his own worldview collapsing. Oh yeah, Jake said, completely oblivious to the fact that he'd just delivered the academic equivalent of a nuclear bomb. I mean, we basically took over the entire planet. We're the only species that actively hunts other predators for sport. We've got this thing called trophy hunting, where we literally seek out the most dangerous animals just to prove we can kill them. Military exercise. Crickstel made a sound like a deflating bagpipe being strangled. You hunt the hunters? All the time, people pay huge amounts of money to go on safari and hunt lions, leopards, elephants. We've got this thing called the Big Five, which is basically a list of the most dangerous animals in Africa, and humans turned it into a shopping list. Several students were now openly weeping. Zephyr Quinn had cycled through so many colors that he was starting to look like a disco ball having a seizure. But here's the really wild part, Jake continued, his enthusiasm growing with each horrified gasp from his audience. We don't just hunt them with our natural abilities. We invented tools specifically designed to make us even more dangerous. Guns, bows, spears, traps. We literally engineered ways to become better predators. Professor Vextel's hands were shaking as he tried to access his emergency contact list. I need to call the dean. This is beyond the scope of my expertise. Oh, and we keep some of the dangerous ones as pets, Jake added helpfully. Dogs are basically domesticated wolves. Cats are miniature tigers. We brought predators into our homes and made them part of our families. Pets? Blorndok's wooden features cracked audibly. You live with predators voluntarily? Well, dogs aren't really predators anymore. We bred most of the danger out of them, although some people keep exotic pets like big cats, bears, and venomous snakes. There's this whole underground market for dangerous animals. People collect them like trading cards. The professor was now frantically typing on his communication device, his claws clicking against the holographic keyboard with increasing desperation. Emergency faculty meeting, Code 7, possible universal threat assessment required. Universal threat? Jake looked genuinely confused. Professor, I think you're overreacting. Humans are actually pretty chill. We've got this whole civilization thing going on. Cities, art, music, literature. We're really quite peaceful. Peaceful? The professor repeated, his voice cracking. You just described a species that actively hunts apex predators for entertainment and keeps them as household companions. Well, when you put it like that, it sounds kind of intense, Jake admitted. But honestly, most of the dangerous stuff happened in the past. These days, we mostly just kill each other. The silence that followed was so complete that you could have heard a pin drop. If pins existed in a universe where everyone was too terrified to make normal pin-dropping sounds. Kill each other? Crickstel squeaked. Oh, not all the time, Jake said quickly, misinterpreting their horror as concern for human welfare. Just when we disagree about stuff. Politics, religion, resources, sports teams. We've got this whole military thing where we train people specifically to be better at killing other humans. It's actually pretty impressive from a tactical standpoint. Professor Vextel's communication device was now buzzing with incoming calls. The dean, the department head, what sounded like several security protocols being activated, and something that might have been the Galactic Threat Assessment Bureau. We've got martial arts, which is basically the science of hand-to-hand combat, Jake continued, warming to his subject. Boxing, wrestling, mixed martial arts. We turn fighting into entertainment. People pay money to watch humans try to incapacitate each other in increasingly creative ways. Entertainment, Professor Vextool repeated weakly, answering his communication device with a trembling claw. Hello? Yes, this is Professor Vextool. We have a situation. The human exchange student has been sharing information about his species' predatory capabilities and… Yes, I understand the implications. No, I don't think he's exaggerating. He described it as pretty chill. Jake looked around the classroom, finally noticing that several students had either fled or were in the process of fleeing. Hey, where's everyone going? Did I miss something important? Mr. Morrison, the professor said, covering his communication device with one shaking hand. Perhaps you should report to the dean's office. Immediately. And maybe don't mention any more details about your home planet until we've had a chance to reassess our safety protocols. Safety protocols? Professor, I think you're really overreacting here. Humans are totally harmless. We're just a bunch of hairless apes who figured out how to make fire and use tools. What's the worst that could happen? Professor Vextool's eye twitched. In the background, his communication device was buzzing with what sounded like evacuation procedures being discussed. What's the worst that could happen? He repeated faintly, as if the words were a prayer to gods who had clearly abandoned him. Mr. Morrison, I'm beginning to suspect that question might be keeping me awake for the rest of my natural life. 3 weeks later, Jake Morrison sat in his new classroom, surrounded by the gentle herbivorous fluffernoids of Kepler 442b. The course was officially called Remedial Herbivore Studies, but everyone knew it was really how to keep the human away from anyone who might have nightmares. So today we're learning about photosynthesis, announced Professor Melandra, a being who looked like a cross between a sunflower and a motivational poster. Her voice carried the careful tone of someone who had been thoroughly briefed on the Jake Morrison situation and was determined not to trigger any accidentally terrifying revelation. Jake raised his hand. Professor, what about carnivorous plants? The entire class of fluffernoids shuddered in unison, their flower-like faces turning toward him with expressions of profound concern. Professor Melalandra's petals wilted slightly. Mr. Morrison, she said gently, perhaps we should focus on nice, safe plants today. Plants that only eat sunlight and water. Right, but I'm just saying, Venus flytraps are technically plants, and they're basically tiny green death traps. And there are these pitcher plants that can digest small animals, and… Mr. Morrison, Professor Melandro's voice carried a note of panic. Perhaps you'd like to tell us about daisies instead. Jake shrugged agreeably. Sure. Oh, did you know that daisies are actually really hardy? They can grow pretty much anywhere. Kind of like how humans adapted to every environment on Earth, from frozen tundras to burning deserts. We're basically the weeds of the animal kingdom. The fluffernoids made a collective whimpering sound. Professor Melandra was frantically signaling to someone outside the classroom. Meanwhile, in the faculty lounge, Professor Vextool sat in a corner, staring at a cup of methane tea that had gone cold hours ago. His once pristine predator classification chart had been replaced with a simple sign that read, System under review, pending Earth data ingration. Any word from the Galactic Threat Assessment Bureau? Asked Professor Quintera, settling her insectoid form into a nearby chair. They've officially classified Earth as a Class X quarantine world, Vextool replied hollowly. Apparently, after reviewing Mr. Morrison's casual descriptions of his home planet, they've determined that Earth represents what they're calling an unprecedented concentration of hostile life forms engaged in active, predatory evolution. And the human? Mr. Morrison has been transferred to a special diplomatic status. He's now considered a cultural exchange hazard and is restricted to courses involving non-threatening subject matter. Vextool's voice carried the weight of a man who had seen too much. They've also issued a galaxy-wide advisory against visiting the Sol system without proper hazardous environment protocols. Professor Quintara's compound eyes widened. Hazardous environment protocols? Apparently, the review board determined that any planet where the dominant species considers recreational proximity to apex predators fun should be approached with extreme caution. Vextool took a shaky sip of his cold tea. They've also recommended psychological counseling for any faculty members who were exposed to detailed descriptions of Earth's ecosystem. Back in the Remedial Herbivore Studies classroom, Jake was cheerfully explaining plant biology to his increasingly horrified audience. Do anyway. That's how pollination works, he concluded. It's actually kind of romantic when you think about it. Plants basically tricking animals into helping them reproduce. Although some plants just skip the whole seduction thing and go straight for chemical warfare, like how some flowers release toxins to kill competing plants. Or how... Sir, Mademoiselle Belle, Professor Melandre interrupted desperately. Perhaps it's time for lunch? Oh, cool. What's for lunch? Please tell me it's not just nutrient paste again. Back home we've got this amazing variety of foods. Meat from all kinds of animals, vegetables that we've selectively bred to be bigger and more nutritious than their wild ancestors, fermented beverages that are technically controlled poison. Professor Melandre fainted, her flower-like form wilting to the floor. That evening, Jake sent a postcard back to Earth. It featured a picture of the Galactic Academy's beautiful crystal spires under a binary sunset, with cheerful text that read, "Having a great time at Space College. Classes are pretty easy, and everyone here is super interested in Earth biology. I think I'm really making an impact on galactic education. The professors keep asking me to share more details about home, and they're always taking notes. It's nice to feel appreciated, even if the coursework is kind of boring. Love, Jake. P.S. Apparently, I'm the first human to ever attend the academy. They're making such a big deal about it that they've created a whole new student category just for me. I feel so special." Back on Earth, Jake's mother stuck the postcard to the refrigerator next to his high school graduation photo and a grocery list that included tiger food for their neighbor's oddly named cat. She had no idea that her son had single-handedly caused the greatest paradigm shift in galactic academic history, or that somewhere in the depths of space, an entire civilization was quietly reconsidering their understanding of predator classification, evolutionary biology, and the terrifying concept of a species that considered mortal danger a fun weekend activity. Professor Vexthul's revised textbook, Predator Classification: A Guide to Universal Threats, revised edition following the Morrison incident, would eventually become required reading across 17 star systems. Chapter 1 was simply titled, "Never Ask a Human About Their Pets." The dedication read, "To Professor Vexthul, who bravely sacrificed his sanity for the advancement of galactic knowledge, and to Mr. Jake Morrison, who taught us that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who don't realize they're dangerous." And somewhere in the remedial herbivore studies classroom, Jake Morrison continued his education, blissfully unaware that his casual observations about Earth had fundamentally altered the galaxy's understanding of what it meant to be truly, terrifyingly alive.